Hello, hi, my name's Colin Jones. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself first of all, so you'll understand where I'm coming from. My background, I have Aboriginal, English and Polynesian. My grandfather's people were Kalkadoon or Kalkadundi, Mount Isa, the other side Nunakal Yugra, Stradbroke Island. My great-grandmother was brought in the slave trade, 1872, and we believe from Raiatea near Tahiti. The English brought Polynesian women out as breeding stock for the European men. And on the white side of my family, my grandmother's people, my great-great-grandparents came from Stratford-on-Avon in England in 1854, the first free settlers into Brisbane. So I'm a real mix-up. On our government files, I was born in 1947. Things hadn't changed too much then, they were starting to. But I'd be classified as the light-skinned half-caste getting closer to Octoroon under the assimilation breeding out programs, which I'm going to explain to you. What I'd like to explain to you, what I've been taught by my grandparents and by family and friends and research I've done myself, is about early Aboriginal history. I want to explain, though, that I'm not saying everything I'm saying is precise and exactly right. It's right as I know and what I've researched, but everybody has their input into things. So as an Aboriginal person, I cannot say, this is what happened here, this is what happened there. We all have a right to our whole history and our culture, and we must respect everybody's history and culture. But now, for my research, when I grew up as a young boy, I was sort of ostracised by the white side of the family and saying that I was a light-skinned half-caste and mongrel bred and wouldn't do anything that was going to be beneficial to anyone, not even to myself. And that used to worry me to an extent. But my grandfather was very strong and taught me, and my grandmother, who was English background but born in Australia, she was very understanding. So I had homeschooling. I sort of got kicked out of school at 11 years of age, not for misbehaving, just that we were learning too much and we only had to be labourers or domestics was the structure when I was growing up. So I was really interested because my grandfather always gave me the idea that I had a lot to be proud of with our ancestry and respect for all sides of my culture. So they got me to look into things. So our early history of Aboriginal people, the research I did to prove that we were not a Stone Age, well, we were Stone Age to an extent, but not a race of people who were unintelligent, didn't understand anything, fought amongst ourselves, had no structure of building houses, no form of government and all these things which has been taught through the education system when I was a young boy. I had to challenge that. And so by challenging that, you go back to our history and what is documented. A lot of it is documented by white Europeans, but at least it's documented. But then we get a lot from our oral visual history, which is handed down, like my grandfather handed down to me and other parts of the family. So how do we live in this land, this huge continent? We didn't have it named under one name like we have now in Australia. We were named after the land where we lived, where we grew up, our clan groups or tribal groups. It's estimated we have between 600 and 800 variations of language and dialect. That can be challenged in many ways, but the fact is we had many languages and many dialects, and we communicated. Now, we looked after the land. In our culture, we didn't say, oh, I own that block of land over there, or I own this piece of land and that rock and those trees over there. We belong to that space. So we didn't own it in the way that the Europeans owned it. The land actually owned us. So I always use it when I talk to my children and my grandchildren now. Now you imagine you're living in a town and you go shopping, you got your Woolworths, you got your Coles and other shops. But what happens when there's no more supplies coming into that shop? It soon runs out. What are you going to do? What did our people do? We were natural greenies and ecologists. We looked after the land, we took what we needed, we never destroyed it, but then we moved on to let that land regenerate. Because if you eat everything and destroy that land, you've got nothing to come back to. And we understood the environment, so we were at one with the land, at one with nature, at one with the plants, at one with the animals. We understood it was a part of growing up. And also children, they were taught at a very early age to have apathy and feeling for not only other people, but for the plants, for the animals. It was not unusual when I was doing my research. You'd read about a little child, and what the mother was teaching that little child was to have feelings just for that one little lizard. It may have had a limp or a sore leg, And the mother would emphasize, look at this poor little lizard. The poor little thing is feeling a little bit of pain. We must feel for that little lizard and look after him and put him in the shade. So the children start to learn and think, must have apathy, must have feelings. And those feelings, as they grow up, also come to other human beings, respect for other people. In Aboriginal culture, respect for the elders. It's interesting when I do research today that we have a structure of elders, and we still have that structure of elders, which is good. But traditionally, when we had those elders, they weren't sitting on a pedestal. Those elders were teachers. They were there keeping the law from the dreaming, the whole structure of how we lived, respect, settling disputes. They were like a whole court of doing things, but they weren't domineering. They were there teaching to help the next generation up that ladder to survive. And it's interesting in my research, it's written by Europeans, and it fits into what we have. For instance, I just want to read you something. This is one of the things that I've researched, which is really interesting, and is similar to what my grandfather taught me. It says, perhaps the nearest thing to a ruling body in traditional society was the group of elders, usually men. Great respect was shown to these recognised elders, whose grey hair usually marked them out from others. Yet it was not merely old age that distinguished them, for some were younger, active men whose abilities and wise counsel were acknowledged. So it shows that we had that understanding. It wasn't just grey hair, it was people with wisdom and knowledge and understanding and living with the sense of keeping our people at well-being, their health and their mental health, their ability to do things. The elders were known for their experience in practical affairs. Now, if you're going to settle a dispute, practical affairs and experience in that is one of the best things you can do. The European structure, I did a course on conflict resolution and mediation with the Attorney General's Department. Well, now what do we have? Our people had this long before we had conflict resolution and mediation. Their knowledge of sacred matters, which are spiritual matters, just like you have in white society today. From time to time, they could act as an informal council and make decisions affecting group members. They could settle arguments and decide what course of action to be followed. Perhaps one elder would be particularly important, and his advice would be specially heeded, though he was not a king or a chief. In fact, the elders were not simply judges or lawmakers, but rather teachers of their fellow man. Now, isn't that humbling? We didn't put ourselves on a pedestal. We were just the ordinary person helping our people to survive with their knowledge and their wisdom. So elders played a very important part, and it's important that our elders today also understand where that come from. It's also important and enlightening for our people to understand that we traded with each other. We had a communication of trade and knowledge, and also settling disputes within that structure. I'm going to explain to you. At the Bunya Mountains, Bunya, when we use the name twice, Bunya, Wagga Wagga, Nulla Nulla, that shows the importance of that area or that item. So the Bunya Mountains was an important place because of the Bunya trees. And so what would happen, the people who were the custodians around that area who belonged to that land, when they seen the bunya nuts were starting to form, and they knew exactly when they're going to be ripe, it may be another 6 or 7 months, and it may happen once every 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years, they would send messages or runners up to the other nations of our people to bring them down to tell them when they were going to come. The interesting thing was, when they sent out messages, it was usually 2 men. The bodies were painted in their artwork, denoting their totem groups, their clan groups, and they would take no weapons. They would go through what we call our song lines, our maps of the land, because we sung of the earth as we went, the sacred places, the areas, what happened in the past, recognition of what was going on in that area and respect for the people who lived there. So song lines, the English called them in English to our language. So as they went along, they would take a message stick. It was not unlike what I'd say today, like a passport, to put it in more simpler terms. It could be painted, carved, or burnt patterns. And those 2 runners would go along those lines and those maps of the land to the other clan groups. When they seen them coming from a distance, the warriors would see 2 men coming. First thing, what are they doing here? What are they coming here for? Are they a threat to our people? They watch intently. As they get closer, they notice they're not carrying any weapons. Then as they get closer, they can see their hand going out because they've got the message stick. And as they get closer, they can see the painting on their body, the artwork of their totem, their clan group. So straight away they know they're here to bring a message. So when they come into that area, what happens? They'll talk about what's happening. The elders in the area where they come from would like them to attend the bunya nut season, the festival. So those people up there knew it was time then to move down to that area to collect the bunya nuts. It wasn't just to get the nuts, because we had plenty of food wherever we were. We understood the environment. But the importance of getting those bunya nuts, because they didn't grow, say, in the Mount Isa area or anywhere like that. It was only over here. But then what do? We use that structure of coming together to settle disputes, to make marriage arrangements, and to trade. Say you're coming from the Mount Isa area and you got the gidgee, you got the mulga, you got the wattle, which is a very hard wood because the rains out there, when it grows, it's very limited rainfall, so the wood grows very densely. It's very strong and very hard, very durable. So they're made into coolamans, wooden bowls. Pitchy or wood is many names for the bowls that the women use. Digging sticks for the women, nulla nullas, boomerangs, clubs, spears. But all these things being hardwood are very valuable. So they were brought down to trade. Red ochre was also traded. But another interesting thing, our stone axes. Because around that area, the Kalkadundi and the other clan groups in that area used a special stone. It's called diorite in the English structure. It's a volcanic stone. And the diorite stones could take up to 500 hours to make a good stone axe. And those stone axes were very prized and valued, and they were traded all over Australia. So when you see these stone axes, you know exactly where they come from what they're made from, what stone. So they were valuable, they were brought down. And we traded whatever the people had in the other area. Marriage arrangements were made because it's important to keep that trade going. And having that marriage arrangements, you had an alliance with that clan group and a family relationship, which was important. Settling disputes is really interesting. I did some research. What the people would do, they knew what disputes were coming up. It could be over many things. It could be a marriage arrangements where someone had run away with somebody else. It could be running someone down or some simple little thing or breaking a law. So those disputes had to be settled for those clan groups to keep moving on in unison. So say there's a problem and they want to settle this dispute. The other clan group coming in, they know what the dispute is. They know it's got to be settled. The group they're going to also know. So there's a vast piece of land, or a piece of land that is cleared, and it's used for dance, for corroboree, as the English call it, and ceremony, but also for settling disputes. So now in my research and what my grandfather taught me, the elders on this clan group would sit up that end, the elders of the other group down this end, or the visiting group. The warriors would stand up each end, the women and the children would sit in the shade of the trees around the other end, and then the elders would say that this dispute, what the dispute was and what had to be settled. So who would come into it? The women would start. The women would run the other women down and the men down, the warriors, and vice versa, and belittle them to get them angry and get them all worked up. Then the warriors would run into the battlefield in the centre. But you must remember there was a law. This is like conflict resolution mediation to an extent. That law was no life had to be taken. No one had to be killed. Blood could be spilt, but no one was allowed to be seriously maimed or killed. So the warriors would come out with their shields and with their clubs and with their spears, and they'd go into battle. And then the women are edging them on and telling the other ones, the other women, that they're warriors, they're weak and they're no good, they're not muscular looking, they don't even look like men, and get them all worked up. So they'd be in there doing battle. And then the elders would be at each end watching very intently what was happening. And then what would happen? When it was getting a little bit out of hand, because the women are still edging on their husbands and screaming out, and the men of their testosterone are coming up and they're really getting into it, the warriors would be fighting like mad, but the elders would see, that's enough. It's getting a bit out of hand now. The dispute has been settled. So what would happen? They'd make signs to the women, and the women then would rush out onto the battlefield and put their arms around their husbands' necks to talk to them and calm them down and lead them back off to their area. So now the dispute had been settled. In actual fact, when you're looking at it, there's no winners. But in reality, it's done the job that it needed to do. The anger's come out, it's been voiced, the opinion is out, but everyone is a winner. That night, that very night, what happens? A corroboree, a dance, everybody's celebrating and singing because they're all friends again and there's no more problems. So isn't that a better way of dealing with warfare within your own structure? And our people did that in that area. There's many things, the marriage arrangements. We had no sexually transmitted diseases in this country till European arrival. Marriage arrangements were very strict and very neatly followed. When I say neatly, marriage arrangements were organised sometimes before a little girl or a child was born to keep that alliance going. And so a man could not take a wife till he was average about 30 years of age. Why? Because he had to go through initiation. A good 70-odd% of our people practice circumcision within their clan groups. So a young boy at puberty, say 12, 13 or 14, he was now starting off to be a young man. So the elders would say it is time for him to be initiated. So we practice circumcision. Interestingly, it's very similar to the Hebrew structure, but the Hebrew structure in Jerusalem back there was a child of 8 days of age because it didn't bleed as much. But we practiced it from puberty. So that young child was circumcised. That was his first step into manhood. Then, second step, he didn't become a full warrior till around 30 years of age. So the scarification in a lot of our clan groups, on his arms, on his chest, on his thighs, there could be lines and cut and little prick holes to make like little circles and so forth. There's many different ways, but that was his knowledge he gained. Like he learnt and gained the knowledge of weather forecasting, medicine, tracking, making weapons, bush medicine, the law, dance, hunting. All these things were knowledge. And as he gained that knowledge and the elders agreed that he now had a full understanding of it, a full grasp of that knowledge, his initiation scars started. So when he reached 30 years of age, he now had all his documentation. We go to university, we get our degrees, we get a piece of paper, we put it on the wall and we're very proud of it. But what happens in our culture, traditional culture, you wore your degrees. Everybody knew what you went through and your ability and your knowledge. So you wore that with pride because you had to earn it with pride. So what happens now? He's roughly about 30 years of age. Now he could legally take a wife. The reason being, he's fully a warrior. He has knowledge of hunting, medicine and law, and he can protect and look after his wife and his children. So quite a good way. Sometimes I wish we still had that. A lot of people would disagree with it. But then what would happen? Now he had children and a wife to look after. So highly organised. But if a young woman was promised in marriage to a warrior, and when the time came for her to go in marriage, she could be about 16, say 15 to 17 years of age, and the warrior's 30 years of age, and she might think, well, I don't really like him. I really like somebody else. Well, she could run away with that person, which sometimes happened, of course, but as long as that person she was in love with wasn't too closely related, because they got married by skin. Skin is not the colour of your skin, it's your relationship too. So if that person was too closely related, they could not get married by law. They'd break the law. They could be speared or stoned to death. The laws were very strict. That's why we had no inbreeding in our culture till European arrival. None of these problems existed in the marriage arrangements. So if she ran away and the person was not closely related, and it was all right and they pledged their love to each other and what they want to do, the elders would usually weaken a little bit and say, okay, it's all right, otherwise she's going to have problems forever, she's going to keep running away and it's not going to work. But if they were too closely related, they could be speared and put to death. And this was a big problem. So the laws were highly respected and regarded. We had those laws. My grandfather taught me as a little boy, with my art, I'm doing here a platypus, Ornithorhynchus, or Plateus pius in the Latin term. Now, when Lieutenant Cook first sailed up the east coast of Australia, and Joseph Banks, a botanist and a scientist, when I did research on him back in England at the British Museum, he was about 26 years of age, about 6'6", very handsome young man, very wealthy, very powerful on the Royal Society of London as a botanist and a scientist, very pompous. He named lots of things after himself. When he got to New Zealand with Cook, Banks Bay, Banks Peninsula, Banks Mountain, and Banks this and Banks that. When he got to Australia, he already named him in New Zealand, so he named the plants. That's why we have Banksia this, Banksia that, named after Joseph Banks. He named them himself. So what happened? He took a pelt, a skin back of the platypus. When he got back to England, the Royal Society of London challenged him. They said no such a creature could possibly exist in reality. It had to be glued or sewn together. A bill like a duck, webbed feet, lays eggs, has fur, has a pouch. Can't exist. They really challenged him. Our people knew the challenge. They knew this creature was quite unique. But what did we come up with? And we understood it was real. It was there. So what happened? The law of marriage was broken. The little wild duck fell in love with the little rat-tailed wallaby. He used to come down to the creek to drink every afternoon. They seen each other, they got to know each other, and they fell in love with each other. But they were two different commodities. They could not be together by law. But they ran away and they mated. The little wild duck laid 2 eggs. Out of that eggs came, in language, one of the languages, Gurri Durri, the platypus. And what happened? Gurri Durri had respect for his mother because he had a bill like a duck. He had webbed feet like a duck to swim. He laid an egg like a duck and lived in the water like a duck. But he also had to respect his father. He had fur like his father, little rat-tailed wallaby. Had a little pouch, and he could also go on the land. So the two became one, but they broke the law, and the shame of breaking that law of this strange little creature, you very rarely see them. They hide in the shadowy places because they know they're breaking the law of marriage. And that's how our people were taught as little children about the law of marriage. And the same with stealing. My grandfather, the main thing he taught me about, I should not ever steal anything that does not belong to me. It's stealing. I must not take it. But how did he explain to me? We say don't steal, that's all right. We remember that, it's wrong, we mustn't do that. But to ingrain it into your mind and into your heart, we have a story. Goes back long before Europeans arrived. Our children were taught, many of our children, different structures and different clan groups, of course, that a young warrior, we talked about initiation. He'd been circumcised but not fully a warrior. Some of his initiation scars, but a lot to learn yet. But the elders had 2 ceremonial shields they used for ceremony, of course, and no one else was allowed to touch them, only fully initiated warriors. But this young warrior, his name was Bajajil, he looked at those shields and he desired them with his eyes, I want to have them for myself as a young teenage man growing up thinking he's indestructible. I really love those shields. I want to use them. Who are they to tell me I can't have them? So what happened? One day the elders and the warriors were away hunting. Bajajil saw his chance. His desire was so great for these material possessions that he went and took those 2 shields. He knew the law, he would definitely be speared and be punished. So he ran to the river, he dived in with the shield and he started to swim to take these shields. That desire was so great he'd leave everything to have these shields. The warriors came back. The first thing they noticed, the 2 shields were not there, they disappeared. They rushed over. What do? We are trackers. They looked straight down to the ground. They seen the footprints. They knew instantly it was Bajajil, the young warrior, because they said they amongst themselves, he's always desired these things. He's always looked and had the wrong attitude to the law. And so they rushed and followed his footprints and here to the river. And here was Bajajil out in the river swimming to the other side. The warriors picked up their spears and their woomeras. They started to throw the spears. As the spears whistled down to Bajajil swimming with these 2 shields, to protect himself, he put one shield underneath and one on his back. He dived down deep under the water to get away from the power of the spears, because as the spears went into the water, they stopped, then they came back to the top. But he had to breathe air, so he had to turn around and swim back up to take a gulp of air. But he had these 2 ceremonial shields. And what happened? They transformed him into Bajajil, the turtle. So that's when you see the turtle today, when the young children, when they're told the story like me, my grandfather would take me down to the lagoon or the billabong and he'd say, look out there, what do you see? And I look, I say, oh, a turtle, Pop. He said, what's it doing? Oh, he said, it's coming up to breathe air. So what have I taught you? Ah, that's Bajajil. He's coming up to breathe air, but he's still got the 2 shields, the ceremonial shields. So his punishment now is confined to that water, where he used to be able to go on land. But now to make him really feel bad, Bajajil the turtle can go from one water hole to the next water hole over land. He can only walk on that land for a short time because he's got to get back to the water. And what does that do? It makes him feel that land that he belongs to, he's now given up because he broke that law by stealing. So when children see Bajajil the turtle coming up to breathe air with his shields, they know hey, we must not steal. Look what happened to Badgerjil. So that's how my grandfather taught me. Very important to feel it in your heart. And our culture felt things in our heart. Now, I was explaining before about the song lines and communication. And you think to yourself, the first thing I thought, I'd say to my grandfather, I'd challenge him, I'd say, but Pop, I said, all these languages and dialects you tell me about, how could we go and communicate? That's impossible to learn 800 languages. Interestingly, my grandfather explained to me in traditional life, and with my research, of course, because you've got to back up things when you're explaining things to other people who don't understand our culture, that children, on a whole, all over Australia, would learn at least 5 dialects of their culture around them, other clan groups, a communication structure. But the interesting thing is, over this whole vast continent, remember, we're not quite as big as the United States. I think the land area is about 52,000 acres less than the size of the United States. And here we are trading over this land. Europeans say go walkabout, but it wasn't walkabout. It was basically trade and ceremony. We respected the land, so we moved around to protect it, but also to trade. Now, what would happen with all our languages? Now, what they found out, all over this continent, our people use the sign language. And we still use sign language. You go to our old reserves and missions, we call communities now. Our older people, we still use the sign language. No, whistle, where you going? Cut them cards. You got any bungu, money? Nah, I got nothing. I'm skint. My pocket empty. Ah, you're no good to me. So things like this. We use it in our own modern way, but traditionally we use it as a sign language to communicate all over the whole continent. Now it's been documented in this book by, here we are here, The Queensland Aborigine by W.E. Roth. Now, very interesting. Now, this is done in the late 1800s, early 1900s. These books are valuable, and I was very privileged to get three of them. And it shows all the different sign languages that our people used. And we use that over the whole continent of Australia, so we could communicate. Now linguistics believe it was so unique, it was equivalent to another spoken language. And the other thing is, we're not a static race of people. In other words, we don't learn new technology or new things. We don't stay sitting back doing nothing. And I always use the example, you look at the tourist information things, and when you're traveling overseas, I lecture in Europe and America and all over the place, and they depict Aboriginal people in tourism. We're standing up there always jet black with a little red lap around us, a little red band around our head, 1 foot on our knee with a spear looking out over the wilderness. I mean, we did that. Some of us still do that, but we don't all do that. That's not what Aboriginal people are about. We're more in depth than that. We've got a lot more to offer. So what it is, within that structure of Aboriginal culture, we need to understand that our people were one with the land. We understood the land. We hunted and gathered. We didn't destroy anything. We knew the seasons. It's like Ghana, the crocodile. Say our people are living up in North Queensland, up in the mountains, and the wet season's coming across. What happens then? We watch. When the wet season's coming, we know it's time to move to the coast. So the elders would send down a few warriors, a couple of warriors, to scout and look ahead. The first thing they look for when they get down to the river system, because when it rains in North Queensland, it really pours down. The river system can rise 18 feet in 10 hours, no trouble. So you've got to be very careful where you are. You don't get washed away and drowned. And so we'd look for nature, what the earth is telling us, and the animals and the plants. You look for the crocodile, the female crocodile. She's a reptile. A reptile, she's cold-blooded. She can't lay her eggs and sit on them and keep them warm. So she scratches up the leaves, the twigs, the grass, and makes a mound. Then she lays her eggs in the centre of the mound. It's the decaying vegetation that produce the heat, and then hatch the eggs, germinate the eggs. The eggs in the centre with more heat become the male, the outside lesser heat become the female. That crocodile has a brain, they estimate, the size of your thumb, but its knowledge and its wisdom of its environment, as Aboriginal people, we had to respect, because she knew how high the floods were going to be before the wet season came. She knew where to make her mound. Very rarely a crocodile's nest gets washed away. So what do our warriors do? They look for where she's laid her eggs and where she's made her nest. And so we instinctively know to move our campsite up a little bit higher, where we're safe from the floods. So then our people can move down in safety and put their camp there. So it's the environment and that knowledge and wisdom of communicating with the earth and with the animals and with the plants. When the long-tailed wattle comes into bloom up in the mountains, our people know it's time to move to the coast. Why? Because the mud crabs are fat and full and ready to harvest, the mullet runs are coming up the coast, and the prawns. So one will tell you the other. So what does that tell you? Knowledge and wisdom of our environment. We were natural greenies and ecologists. Europeans would love to have that ability and that knowledge now that our people used to have of our land. And a lot of our people still do have of our land. So when they say that we didn't look after our environment or we wandered around aimlessly, not true, far from the truth. I mean, I cannot have enough time to put into all the information how our people looked after the land and respected each other, because I'd need a week to talk to you, and that would bore you to tears, no doubt, from me raving on. What I'd like to explain now, that's only a little drop in the ocean. I talked about how we looked after our land and how we were one with the land. But now I want to talk about the European structure when they arrived. But before they arrived too, their land. We look what happened to our people, which I'll go through a little bit later. The atrocities, the killing of our people, the removal of children, the removal of our people to missions and reserves and children to dormitories. All these were horrific. But the interesting thing is, it's happened all over the world. Obviously, it's happened everywhere with colonization to the Americas, to the native population of America, to Africa, to Southeast Asia, South America. It's happened everywhere. We're a little bit unique without being biased because all this has happened in the last just over 200 years. That's not very long for a place to be colonized by a European power. And it didn't just happen in 1788. That was in what we call now New South Wales and Sydney, but it happened. It took 26 years for the Europeans to get over the Blue Mountains, over the Blue Mountain Range, to get up to the top of the mountains to find the vast plains they could use. That was 26 years because they didn't know how to get up. But how'd they get there? Following our maps, our song lines, using Aboriginal people, the tracks that we used to get up the mountains. Then Brisbane was settled. What happened there? 1854, right? Not 1788. So 1854. Colonisation started in that area. You go to North Queensland, Cairns, north of Cairns, the Palm River Goldfields, Cape York Peninsula, 89 years ago. You go to some parts in Arnhem Land, probably about 69 years ago. You go to the western parts of the desert from Central Australia, probably 50, 60 years ago. So colonisation is still happening in reality. A lot of our people still do not speak English in the western desert areas. So that's a part of the colonisation and the effect it's having today. So don't just think 200 and something years, 1788, it's a process of going through it because we're such a large continent. And this is where our people are still going through this colonisation impact. Now, what did the Europeans have when they left England? We look at them too, in their plight. Because you had a hierarchy of kings, queens, and so forth, and the aristocrats, the wealthy, the nobility. We didn't have that. We had a body of elders who were like teachers. Everybody was on that same level of respect. So these people over there, you think of the poor, lower class people, the peasants, what they were going through. And you have to have apathy. Remember, our people were taught apathy and respect and feeling, and we had that. And you have to have that for the European structure, what was happening. And back there, children were not seen as human beings till they reached 9 years of age. They were classified as soulless creatures. What did we do? We loved our children, very rarely disciplined in the way of smacking, but through word of mouth and training and teaching. Children were loved and respected and cared for. So a mother could have a child in our traditional culture, and of course mothers get tired. The mother's sister could then take over that role, and she was also called mother. And so we have many mothers in our structure, many fathers, our fathers' brothers. So their role was protecting, training, discipline, and looking after. So having that network was a safety network. What have we got today? We got Centrelink, but different. We had the reality of people. And that was a very important part. But now you go back to this, in Europe and England especially, we had what was happening, the lower classes. In Europe, they called them peasants. In England, they were called the great horde of unclean or unwashed. Their living conditions were pretty gross, compared with ours. Ours was superb. We were living in a paradise in reality. And so what was happening? Children, as I said, were not classed as human beings till they reached 9 years of age. An interesting thing with your research I found out, we know about the mining in England, going down the colliers of coal to get the coal out to keep the houses warm because of the snow and the freezing winters. And so the gas, the natural gases in the mine, what would the British do? They would send down a canary in a cage. If that canary fell off the cage dead, they knew the gases were there. Detrimental to humans as well. So did they send down a man to mine with a canary in the cage? They'd send young children, young boys under 9 years of age with the canary in the cage. The canary fell off, dead. The young boy may make it back if he hurried, otherwise he was overcome with the gas and he would die as well. But it eased their conscience because he was only a child. He was not a human being till he reached 9 years of age. Even the churches agreed they were soulless creatures. And that's why the chimneys in England, with all the soot from the coal, when I did my research over there at the British Museum in London, they would send, or what they would do, get young boys and sometimes young girls, and they would put hessian bags around, tie them around them and a rope around them, and they would climb on the bottom. They'd put a stick down and he'd hook the rope and they'd pull that child up through the chimney to get the soot out. And what's a glamorised version of it? Mary Poppins. Look at the things, the history goes back, but it's romanticised a lot. So children were used to clean the chimneys. They must have done well for their lungs and whatnot. But another very horrible aspect of it too, which I want to read to you, was sexually transmitted diseases, what was happening. Yeah, one of the terrible things, I mean, we had lots of terrible things happen all around the world, but for our people, I mean, we hear of the shootings, the poisoning, the massacres of our people, but a big percentage of our people died through sexually transmitted diseases, which was not here originally till European arrival. Interestingly, in the research on blood on the wattle, it's by Bruce Elder, really interesting and really factual and right to the point. It says a strange cure for sexually transmitted diseases or venereal disease. What was happening in England at the time, and Europe obviously, was that if gonorrhea and syphilis were rampant, they were everywhere. So the common theory and belief was if a man had sexual relations with a 9-year-old virgin and under, it would help ease his disease or completely cure it. So the little young children up to 9 years of age were used to get rid of sexually transmitted disease. You imagine what would happen after that. It just spread everywhere, went rampant. And so you think this was terrible what was happening back in England. And it was happening. It's documented in London and all the files and the history. But now remember, when the first Europeans arrived here in 1788, it took a year to get to Australia. You couldn't just get on the phone, ring up and say what was happening in London and what's happening in Australia. So mail would have to come, research would come, theories would come. It took a long period of time. So what was happening? These people who arrived, the Europeans into Australia, still had this theory that sexually transmitted diseases could be eliminated if they had sexual relations with a young virgin and who was clean. They could rid them of their disease. And they were practicing that with our people. And you think, that can't be right. And when I lectured to different universities and different white societies, they said, oh no, we would never have done that. And it's not blaming anyone, it's actually evidence and fact. These are things that have happened all over the world. I'm going to read you something. It says here, a strange cure for venereal disease. The spread of venereal disease, unknown in Australia to the arrival of the whites, had a devastating effect on the Aboriginal population. While some venereal disease was obviously transmitted in total ignorance, Mounted Constable Thorpe argued that there was a history of conscious transmittal by certain bushmen at the turn of the century. When we hear the term bushman, it means people working in the country. Today we call them ringers and drovers and whatnot on cattle stations, sheep stations, but these they refer to as bushmen. It says, a very silly yet general impression exists among some ignorant bushmen that when suffering from gonorrhea, all they need to do is to impart the disease to some female, then the severity of such a disease upon themselves would be greatly modified or perhaps totally cured. You see how this theory filtered through from way back in England? We were isolated and those theories were still in the minds of people because when people move, they take their culture, they take their beliefs and their theories with them. Then it says, I have seen poor young gins, referring to our young girls, mere children between 11 and 14 years of age, suffering from syphilis in all its stages. The old blacks assured me that the white man had run them down and ruined them. So that theory was happening in the late 1800s up to the early 1900s under that theory in England when the churches said these children were soulless creatures and it would help get rid of their disease. So you see how these things come. And now you look at it and you want to blame people, but the people who were doing this is what they were taught back in England. So they arrive with their theories and their ideas as well, and their culture. But the culture, of course, was not right, wasn't good, because we know now, and always have done, that these things, by transmitting sexual disease, the next person's obviously going to get it and spread it on, and that person's going to suffer. So these are some of the things that were happening in England. So these people really believed that. Women were not classified as, well, women were seen as not valuable than, no more valuable than a cow. If a woman and the husband died and he had a farm and cattle and a house, that woman could not inherit that because she was only a woman. In our culture, women were respected, women played a big part. Sometimes women could also be elders with their knowledge and wisdom. And women had women's business and men's business was separate. So women were highly regarded and respected. So we were ahead of that European structure. But the people arriving were not ahead, they were way down here, and that was their beliefs. And they in turn put those beliefs on our people, which were pretty horrible, but that's what happened. Because they believed what they were doing was okay and was right. Now, the other thing which is interesting, the early Europeans didn't believe that we were quite human. And this is a really big thing because it eased the conscience of what was happened to our people. I'm going to read you a few things. Well, for instance, we know in many of the museums in Australia and around the world, we have skulls, bones and skins of our people because we were a collectible commodity. Why were we a collectible commodity? I'll jump the gun a little bit. I want to explain 1967 with the referendum. The English education system deals with the referendum, but when you talk to our older people especially, who have been through before and after and what was going on, then you get a full understanding. 1967, on a piece of paper, we were now granted citizenship in our own country. We first had a right to vote. Some states had voting in, but under limited situations. They had marriage arrangements in a limited situation where you could pick a partner, but the government had the last say. But I'll explain that a bit later. But in 1967, in reality, we first had the right to vote, to make your own marriage arrangements, to further your education, to open your first bank account. We never had money till then, in most cases. To apply for a passport. I knew I had to apply for a passport. To possibility of owning land. All that happened on paper in 1967. You imagine, that's only 46 odd years ago. But it didn't happen straight away. It took a few years after that. But in 1967, we were granted citizenship in our own country. In 1901 in Melbourne, with the government, we became the Commonwealth of Australia, Federation of Australia, under the British government, right? The Federation of Australia, Commonwealth of Great Britain, I should say. And that was at in Melbourne, the old building down in Melbourne that was built in for the World Trade Expo, the same time as the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And so what did it say under the White Australia policy? No Italians, no Greeks, no Maltese, no Spanish, no Jewish people allowed to the country. Definitely no Asians and no black races allowed in. This was the theory, to keep Australia pure, white, beautiful British stock was the theory. But then it goes on to say that they believed that the full bloods would die out, our people, and the light skins could be bred out. So they'd gradually get rid of us to keep it white. We were already here. Now, because that we were seen as valuable commodities, further back than that, I want to explain a couple of things to you. Our skulls, bones and skins were collectible commodities. We were quite a unique race of people. The Royal Society of London declared that we were not quite human. That's why in 1967, which I forgot to explain, in 1967 we got citizenship, the right to vote and all this sort of thing. But you know what we were filed under? Fauna and flora. From the Latin term fauna, animals, flora, plants. We're under plants and animals, not human, for flora and fauna. And then it made me think, where on earth did they get this theory? Why were we fauna and flora? We're human beings. But in reality, in 1967, all Aboriginal people in Australia were first granted human status because we were no longer under fauna and flora. Interesting. Now, I was 20 years, 6 months and a few days old. I became legally a citizen of my country and, without doubt, a human being on the British files. I knew I was, but we were never classified as that. So it's interesting when you look at all these things. Now you start to challenge, where did that come from? The teachings back in England and Europe. What happened in 1967 goes way back. Now, I won't go through the whole structure of it, but the great chain of being, or great chain of human beings. And it's used in our history a lot under the European colonisation structure. For instance, shooting Aboriginals or blacks was no worse than shooting wild dogs. What was the wild dogs? They were the dingoes. They used to get a scalp and get a payment from the government. So it was no worse than shooting a wild dog to shoot an Aboriginal person, because we were not quite human on the British files. And the propaganda going out that here we were still here, we could be shot because we weren't quite human, we had no feelings. Now, just to give you a little bit of an idea, I mean, I want people to respect that it's not me saying these things, it's the research done on us by Europeans, but it's also our history through handed down our oral visual history. So they clash. And rightfully so, because we know what our oral visual history is. But the Europeans didn't understand that. So because in 1967 we were still filed under fauna and flora, I really wanted to research that and find out how come they didn't think we were quite human beings. Now you go back, some of the evidence is documented about us. Aboriginal Australians, it's by Richard Broome. And some of these books, we know that it sounds very horrible and derogatory, but it's our only means of knowing what happened to our people from the European point of view. And so when you're teaching, and I say teaching, not lecturing, but teaching people the reality of what happened to our people and the pride that we still have because we're still here, and pride in our history and our background as survivors, and we are survivors. We have to know why. And in Aboriginal culture, we also have to know, we know our past, our present and our future. It's important. You cannot move ahead if you don't know your past. How can you pass on the law, the dreaming, the history, family, where we come from, if we don't know our past? It's so important. But when we see the horrible things that happen, it hurts, the pain is there, the tears in your eyes, but it shows we are resilient, we are a strong race of people. And any race of people, not just Aboriginal people who survived these things. And there's many aspects of it. You look at the Second World War with Hitler and the Nazi concentration camps. I've been through Dachau and Auschwitz, and you think, your heart goes out, because you know our people went through a very similar thing. And we all have feelings and emotion because we are all human beings. But what does it say here in the research of us? It says, by the 1840s, at the height of the Southern Frontier War against the Aborigines, some Europeans, not all, some Europeans were claiming that Aborigines were not merely savages, but not even men, being a species of tailless monkeys. Interesting. Remember, flora and fauna we were filed under? It says, this was a convenient view of the colonist who claimed that killing Aborigines was no worse than destroying wild dogs. So what's that setting up? These people who were shooting our people had the belief through their country and where they come from, through the sciences and the government, that we weren't quite human. So to eradicate, they wanted the land. That was more important to them. And so we were like tailless monkeys. Interesting, when that concept comes in, it eases the conscience of the massacres and the killings of our people. Now, I can read you for a week all this documentation, but it's important just to understand a few of the things. Now, because we weren't quite human, we didn't have the same feelings as humans, so they said. It says, one Western Australia squatter claimed that flogging with a cat of nine tails, we know what that is, the little leather strips or rawhide with the knots put in it, sometimes just with leather or sometimes with bits of bone or sometimes with bits of lead weights in it. It didn't hurt Aboriginals as much as it hurt white people. Now, can you imagine an Aboriginal man getting a lashing with a cat o' nine tails, and a white man, like the convicts used to get in early settlement in Hobart and Norfolk Island and wherever, it didn't hurt the black fella as much as it hurt the white fella. This was their theory. And you think, well, why? Because it goes on to say, it should be remembered a native has a hide and not an ordinary skin like ordinary human beings. So straight away, we're dehumanized. So we didn't have the same feelings. So we felt it, believe me, we would have felt it, but it eased the conscience of the Europeans that we were not quite human. Interesting. Then there's many, many things on that, what was happening. Now, I want to go through a couple of terminologies, which is interesting. The Royal Society of London named things in Greek and Latin. It was the world's most spoken and written language at that time. So things are documented in Greek and Latin. Now, the Royal Society of London named things all around the world. We have with Joseph Banks, he named our trees. He named it eucalyptus, which is named in the Greek, eucalypti. You are well covered and protected. You think, what's he talking about? A pod of a flower of one of our eucalyptus trees. This is one Western Australia. So it has a pod, and inside it has the little bright little armlets that come out, the little flower itself, all pushing out like little pieces of string, all brightly coloured, be red, pink, yellow, white, and that's our eucalyptus. Now, when that pod's got the little flower inside, it has a little cap over it. And we remember it sometimes as kids. I remember as a kid, my cousins, who their family were white, they had the little book on the gumnut babies, which is based on the story of the eucalyptus tree. They'd put the little caps on the head. So here was this pod with the flower with the little cap. So translated in Greek, you are well covered and protected. Eucalypti, English, eucalyptus. That's where it comes from the Greek. You are well covered and protected. You look at our platypus and our echidna, porcupine, favourite food for our people. A lot of our family in Cherbourg, around that area, favourite food, porcupine, because it tastes like pork and got pine needles on it, pretty sharp. But the word named by Joseph Banks in 1770 was echidna, from the Greek echidnos. And what does echidnos mean in Greek? Viper, serpent, or snake. And you think, well, where'd they get that from? How could it be a viper, serpent, or snake? Through science, the platypus and the echidna are the only two monotremes in the world. They are egg-laying mammals. Their structure of their bones is reptilian, like a reptile, like a sanguine, or like a crocodile. And its movement on the land is like a reptile, the way it moves. Its eyes are like a reptile. And so what's it do? It lays eggs like a reptile. But the male echidna and the male platypus, during the mating season, they eat certain foods which builds up poison residue in the poison sac. Then it has two veins going to its back legs, and on its back legs it has two big fangs that they fight with. So echidna, serpent, viper, or snake, has the poison and veins to the fangs on its back leg. So that's where that terminology comes from. So it's important to know how things were named, especially in our country. Now you think, how were we named? Aboriginal. It's a little bit worrying when you start to study Latin. The Royal Society named things all around the world. They named people around the world to fit into the little boxes of the British Royal Society of London. If we didn't fit in the little boxes, we were squashed till we did fit in under their theory and their eyes. So they named things in the Pacific. My great-grandmother was brought in the slave trade, 1872, from the Pacific, and they were Polynesian background. So the word Polynesian, from Greek, Polos Nesios, many islands. Not the Polynesian language as we know it. Micronesia, north of Papua New Guinea. Little islands. From Greek, Mikros Nesios, small islands. What do we get in our phone? Microchips. Little Nissan car called a micro. It's small. So it comes from the Greek term small, Mikros. Then we get Melanesia, which takes in Torres Strait Islands, Papua New Guinea, Rabaul, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Fiji, New Caledonia. Now, the word Melanesian has a big part to play in our culture because a lot of the people were brought over during what they called the Kanaka slave trade and mixed in with our people. My wife's family, they have the Kanaka slave trade from Harvey Bay, Maryborough, around that area. And so they were given the name where they come from, Solomon, Lifu, Gala or Gila, and many names, but from the islands. But the word Melanesian was also named by the Royal Society of London. Melos, meaning black, and Nesios, meaning island, the Black Islands, because they were black people, and they called it blackbirding. So when you look at that, we were not named in our own name. We were named by the Royal Society of London under science in Greek. So you get to the term, just quickly, in America. I lecture at different universities in the United States. And the native population, we commonly called them Indians. And wrong term again. When we were kids, we played cowboys and Indians. All the white side of my family and friends were the white cowboys. I was the only dark one, so I was an Indian. I always knew what was going to happen. I was going to get tied up and shot and burned at the tree. So I used to run like mad to get away from them. But anyway, what I'm getting at, when the English and the Spanish arrived on the east coast of the Americas, they believed they'd hit the east coast of India, because the world hadn't been explored yet. And so what happened? Now they named them Indians, because they thought they were on the east coast of India. Later on, during colonization, they realized they weren't in India at all. India had now been, the Pacific Ocean had been explored more, and they realized India was a separate continent. So they had to change it. So to rectify it, they called them Red Indians because of their coppery-coloured skin. They were still not Red Indians. It wasn't until 30-odd years ago the native population of the Americas went to Congress and demanded a name change. They still have their identity of like Navajo, Comanche, Apache, Cheyenne, Hopi, whatever they may be, but they come under one group of First Nations of people, which is not derogatory, because they are the First Nations of that land, and they have their identity of their clan groups, their tribal groups, as I said, Cheyenne, Comanche, Navajo, whatever it may be. So they rectified it that way. Now we get into the term Aboriginal. Interesting. Aboriginal is used in Canada. They call it the Aboriginal people of Canada, the first people up there, and many other places in Africa. And we have the Aboriginal people of Japan, the Ainu of Japan, the Science Authority referred to them as. Where did the term Aboriginal come from? It's not a good term. The Catholic Church, I've lectured in Milan, Genoa and Rome. I've been to the museum in Rome. I've seen some of the archives footage of the books and research, and it just opens your eyes to think how much we do not know in reality. Because what does it say? It says, the Catholic Church taught the earth was flat. You sailed too far over the rim of the world, right? Christopher Columbus approached the monarchy, the Catholic Church in Spain, Portugal, many times to get funding for ships to explore. He was refused. Finally, he was in Spain. He approached the monarchy of Spain, especially the Queen of Spain and the Catholic Church in Spain. He said whatever lands he'd find, he'd claim for the crown of Spain, the Queen, and any wealth for the Catholic Church. They couldn't resist. So they funded him 3 ships. So he was on the Santa Maria, Santos Maria, St. Mary. Now, he sailed across the North Atlantic, down through what we call today the Caribbean, to the northern part of South America, back through around Cuba today, past the Florida Keys and back to Spain. But the important thing he had now, he had mathematical proof that he had circumnavigated the earth. The earth was actually round. The Catholic Church had to keep in control through the Spanish and the Portuguese Science Authority, because they were the leading seamen at that time, or one of the leading seamen at the time, and explorers. And so if the earth was now round, the church came up with their science, a theory. If the earth was round, Europe was a huge continent on top of the world. So in that case, if all this weight was on top of the world, there had to be another major continent underneath to balance it. Otherwise, with the weight on the top, it would overbalance and wobble and topple over. So what they name us in Latin, Terra Australis Incognita, land south invisible. We translate the Great South Invisible Land. Now, the theory was anything on the top was normal. Anything underneath was the opposite to normal. So we have the term antipodes or antipode. Antipode, feet coming off your head, because they didn't look like the normal humans. They were the opposite to normal. And so here we were the opposite, down underneath the southern hemisphere, because they hadn't explored it. So what do we get? English derives from Latin, Germanic, and French, and others, but they're the main ones. So in Latin, English, normal, abnormal, original, aboriginal. So it's Latin. What does Aboriginal mean? From the origin of man. What does evolution teach the origin of man? Monkeys, apes, more closely related to primates than modern man. And you think, come on, you lead me up the garden path. That can't be the reality of it. I thought so too. Always back your things up with evidence and bibliography with research.